Before Castro ended his 5-week visit, he received 3 medals, attended countless government functions. This one happens to be May Day. And he was credited by the Russians with organizing the triumphant struggle for freedom and independence of the heroic Cuban people and for a worthy contribution to the great cause of peace and socialism. The real importance of the trip, however, was that Fidel and Nikita Khrushchev decided to be friends again. Castro had been sulking ever since October of 1962, when Khrushchev, confronted in effect by an American ultimatum, decided to withdraw those missiles from Castro's island. At Moscow, Castro made a few speeches about the imperialist monster he has for a neighbor and reportedly went home happy. This was another facet of our relations with Cuba. In September, the House Committee on Un-American Activities decided to hold hearings on the illegal visits of students to Cuba. The scuffle started when some young demonstrators entered the House caucus room shouting, "Racists and fascists, go home." People were knocked to the floor, fists flew, chairs were overturned, and there were screams charging police brutality in the chamber. In every year, there are great stories of human endurance or courage or tragedy that don't relate to major movements of history or of nations. This year, there was one that ran for 14 days to a partially happy ending. This is the Felon coal mine in Shepton, Pennsylvania. But these men and this equipment weren't digging for coal. They were after Dave Felon and Hank Throne, 2 miners who had been trapped 331 feet below ground for almost 2 weeks.
Hello, Davey.
Hello.
This is Owen's brother, Freddie. Why, I was just talking to Father Roman, and he says if you can't possibly make it to Mass tomorrow, it's all right.
Right.
Yeah.
Make every effort.
He says make every effort, but if you can't make it, it's all right.
All right. I will. I'll try.
Okay.
Okay.
The man behind the drill was Mike Rank. One wrong move, and he would have sent thousands of tons of coal and earth down on Throne and Felon. He didn't make that wrong move.
Take it up. Move on with it.
Take it all the way up?
Yeah, all right.
Give it back to the Indians?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, Mike, take it all the way up, Mike, and take it out. You did a good job, Mike.
Throne was the first rescued, just 10 minutes before 2 o'clock on the morning of the 14th day.
Okay, Dave, do you hear that? They got handcuffs. Yeah, now it's your turn, Betty. Do you hear me? Dave, he's up now. Do you hear me? Now we're going to get you up too, all right?
Felon, who owned the mine, was up less than an hour later. It would have been a completely happy ending, except for the third man who had been trapped, Lou Bova, presumably in a little hole not far from Throne and Felon. They kept trying for quite a while, but they never found Bova, alive or dead. One of the significant aspects of 1963, before November and after, is that it is the year before 1964 and presidential elections. This has been particularly interesting to Republicans, none of whom is president at the moment. Ever since last May 4th, when he married Mrs. Margaretta Murphy, New York's Governor Rockefeller has been something of a cheerful gambler. He accepted the political risks of divorce and remarriage, but he hopes that time and public exposure to the new Mrs. Rockefeller will turn the odds his way before the Republican convention next year. He has reason to hope. Mrs. Rockefeller's 5th grade yearbook noted her bright smile and perpetual good humor. Her friends today call her Happy. Happy's charm has been evident at a number of social events this year, like this floating charity ball. "Hiya," the governor kept repeating. "Glad to see you. Meet Mrs. Rockefeller." The Duke and Duchess of Windsor know well the perils of divorce and remarriage. Comparisons were inevitable, but the governor never even mentioned abdicating. Anyhow, Governor Rockefeller is an announced candidate for the Republican nomination for president, the only one so far. And here, as he does some campaigning in New Hampshire, he's acting like one. Rockefeller plans to enter the New Hampshire primary in March. And he plans to be in good shape. To underscore a potential president's interest in international affairs, Governor Rockefeller visited Europe in the fall and took a look at something that might give him considerable worry as president, the Berlin Wall. Another notable visitor to Berlin this year was Richard Nixon, a man who almost was president 3 years ago and a force to be reckoned with in 1964, although he hasn't said so. Some people see Nixon as satisfying both liberal and conservative wings of the Republican Party. Besides belonging to the Republican Party and showing an interest in Berlin, Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. Nixon have something else in common, their address. They both live at 810 Fifth Avenue in New York. Somewhat afield from Nixon and Rockefeller, both geographically and politically, is Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. The polls say he is a front runner for the Republican nomination. The occasion for all of this was a frontier celebration in Prescott, Arizona. High noon on a horse or push-ups in New Hampshire, any way you look at it, it figures to be an interesting year for the Republicans. In October of this year, if Sandy Koufax had asked for the city of Los Angeles as a gift, he might well have gotten it, with Malibu and Long Beach tossed in for the rest of the baseball Dodgers. For the Dodgers beat the New York Yankees in 4 straight games in the World Series, and looking back on it, you should have seen it coming from the first game, which Koufax pitched. Phil Scheffler described his achievement that historic day.
The story here today was Dodger pitcher Sandy Koufax, who broke Carl Erskine's 10-year-old record of World Series strikeouts by fanning 15 Yankee batters. This is the way he did it. Kubek strikes out swinging. Richardson swinging. Tresh looks at third strike. Mantle looking. Maris swinging. Pepitone swinging. Kubek second time swinging. Richardson again. Tresh looking again. Mantle again swinging. Lopez swinging with bases loaded. Howard swinging. Linz swinging. Richardson for the third time. And pinch hitter Harry Bright, the last Yankee of the day, goes down swinging as the Yankees lose the opener and Carl Erskine's strikeout record falls.
It was Koufax in baseball, but the athlete of the year in indoor netless freestyle badminton was Nikita Khrushchev, who gave Dean Rusk a workout at Khrushchev's shore place on the Black Sea. These scenes don't do badly at talking about the difference between 1963 and 1962, so far as America's relations with Russia went. In 1962, the Cuban face-off. In 1963, badminton and the treaty to ban nuclear testing, which President Kennedy called a significant beginning to a possible path out of terror for the world. There were a couple of problems about Berlin, but in general, Khrushchev, for whatever reason, his own troubles or a developing common sense, for whatever reason, he eased up a little. It became clear this fall that professional football is now of age as a major, perhaps the major, American spectator sport. The complicated reasons that people like it are typified in a professional by the name of Y.A. Tittle, who calls plays and throws passes for the New York Giants, again this year's Eastern champions of the National Football League. He throws them to halfbacks like Frank Gifford. He throws them to backs like Joe Morrison. and the people fill the stands and love it. One of the first things that Lyndon Johnson did as president was to rename Cape Canaveral for John Kennedy. Except for that solemn event, the Cape has not been too much in the news in recent months. But there was excitement there last May. America's longest manned space flight, and the only one this year, was launched from what was then Cape Canaveral on May 15th.
3, 2, 1, ignition, liftoff at 04 after the hour, liftoff.
That's Major Leroy Gordon Cooper going up for a 22-orbit ride of 600,000 miles. The launch was just about perfect, and so was the long succession of orbits. But a day and a half later, Cooper's Faith 7 capsule developed some electrical trouble, some electronic manually, piloting his capsule back to Earth through the deadly heat of re-entry. In his own words, he hit his target right on the old bazoo, and he was immediately plucked out of the Pacific by the aircraft carrier Kearsarge. Cooper spent 34 hours and 20 minutes in space and proved the value of man's mind and training in space. After the suspense, a happy ending. This phone call typifies Russia's space achievement of the year. Nikita Khrushchev chatting with Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. This is the way they saw it on Moscow television.
Это торжество борьбы народа нашего, и мы горды за
And then in November, the first space wedding. Miss Tereshkova married a fellow cosmonaut, Major Andrei Nikolaev. And after the wedding ceremony in a Moscow wedding palace, there was a big official reception where Premier Khrushchev played the part of father to both bride and groom. He even hinted that they might make space voyages together in a capsule built for two. Every year is the last year for some of us. Along with the deaths of overwhelming impact in 1963, some 56 million others around the world left us to join what newspaper writers used to call the great majority. These were 18 of the 56 million. Robert Frost, Adolphe Menjou, William Carlos Williams, Irénée DuPont, Skinny Ennis, David Lowe, Zazu Pitts, Senator Tom Connolly, Glenn Gray, Aldous Huxley, Dick Powell, Hugh Gaitskell, Elsa Maxwell, Estes Kefauver, Tony Anastasia, Clifford Odets, Diana Churchill, Monty Woolley. One obituary of the year was short and pitiful. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, dead of a respiratory difficulty 2 days after his premature birth last August. John Kennedy took that blow with public dignity and reserve. But along with the record of the years in the presidency, it may have put a little age into his face. Certainly no one would have said in the 1964 campaign what some people said in 1960, that he looked immature for the job. There was no question that he would campaign, At nearly every news conference, a question touched on his try for a second term, and it was clear that he looked forward to it and hoped next November to get the big victory instead of the thin one he got in 1960. His trips were becoming more and more like campaign tours, and he seemed to be enjoying them more than ever. The polls showed him running ahead of any possible Republican candidate in spite of some unfavorable reaction to his strong civil rights stand. All in all, as 1963 waned, the Kennedy exuberance seemed well-founded. This was the Kennedy family on the 13th of November. It marked one of Mrs. Kennedy's first appearances since the death of her infant son in August. It was at this time that Mrs. Kennedy agreed to take an active role in her husband's campaign for re-election. Thus, she was with him when he went to Dallas on November 22nd. Dan Rather reports.
Texas Governor John Connally, soon to fall wounded before the same assassin as shot the president, accompanied Mr. Kennedy. There were the usual formalities, a rather large committee wearing reception badges. The crowd, many of them in their late teens, seemed particularly charmed with Mrs. Kennedy. Like other airport reception lines, flowers for the ladies. Flowers which were to finally wind up crushed in the floor of the presidential limousine. During these airport formalities, there's usually a rising alertness on the part of the Secret Service men, and the president, as he's done many times before, did not settle for the official reception. Once the reception line was passed, the presidential couple headed for the crowd to move along the fence and shake as many hands as possible in 5 or 6 minutes. This, a presidential routine said to give Secret Service men some of their more anxious moments. Handshakes and greetings for perhaps a couple hundred Texans. The last such greetings a crowd like this would receive from John F. Kennedy. The motorcade's principal vehicle to carry President and Mrs. Kennedy and Texas Governor and Mrs. Connally. The motorcade route was to wind twice through downtown Dallas before going to the scene of the second speech at the Trade Mart. Because the rain had stopped, the limousine top was down. Where the crowds were heavy, the procession moved rather slowly, giving the thousands along the route a good look at the young president and his lady. And further downtown, one man was watching whose purpose was not to welcome the president, but to murder him. Several floors above the cheering crowds, a man waited with a 6.5 rifle. The motorcade moved leisurely down Main Street, where the crowds were the heaviest. It headed for the edge of the business district in Houston Street. The Trade Mart and a luncheon crowd was still slightly less than 2 miles away. Then something happened. The joyous crowd was suddenly panicked. People ran in every direction. Sirens screamed. Terse, excited messages crackled over the radio system of the Dallas Police Department. The president and his party had been rushed in the presidential limousine to Parkland Hospital. As Mr. Kennedy and Governor Connally lay in the emergency room, the limousine stood outside, empty, except for the bouquet of roses Mrs. Kennedy had been carrying in her arms. They lay now forgotten forever in the back of the car. Mrs. Kennedy was in the emergency room, dry-eyed now, controlled, watching as the doctors fought to save her husband's life. She knew from the first, say the surgeons, that the fight was hopeless, the wound too massive and dreadful.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
The president was dead. A senator cried. So did people who were not senators. Back the way she had come, in an ambulance now which bore her husband's body. No roses, no smiles, no waving crowds. The president was dead, and his widow was taking him home. Federal Judge Sarah Hughes, a friend of Vice President Lyndon Johnson, was called to administer the solemn oath which made Mr. Johnson the President of these United States. The oath was given aboard the presidential aircraft, which then rolled heavy and screaming, rolling and lifting for far-off Washington, bearing the new president and the dead president, and trailing black smoke through the skies of Texas. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's disastrous, mortal visit to the Lone Star State was over.
Now it was Sunday, the moving of the body to the Capitol. 6 gray horses, the caisson, and a spirited riderless horse drew up before the White House. Our Washington correspondents continue the report.
And now the casket. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, leaving the White House for the last time. Mrs. Kennedy, Caroline, and John. Now the cortege is forming ahead of the caisson. And now the caisson and the casket are moving down the drive, flanked by 20 military men from the 5 military services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and Coast Guard. And now the muffled drum corps has moved off ahead of the cortege down Pennsylvania Avenue.
about to turn. She's watching a wreath being carried in. It's the wreath of the Vice President. He is accompanying it to the bier. President Johnson, in the utter silence here, is going to the bier with a huge wreath of, it looks to me like chrysanthemums. I don't, it's turned away from me, I can't see it. There will be another huge wreath, I'm told, from the Senate of the United States. The President is going back to stand beside Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and daughter are walking up to the casket. This will be her last goodbye for today. She
People by the thousands visited the rotunda to pay their last respects. The mighty and the meek, alone and in family groups, they filed through the rotunda all night. And then it was Monday and time for the walk to the church.
Now the caisson approaches the northwest gate, followed by the personal flag of the President of the United States. And the riderless horse. And now comes the family, the Attorney General, Mrs. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy. Behind them, other members of the family. Then President Johnson. Apparently another change in plans. And then in cars, the first of the dignitaries. And then, marching along behind, come the heads of state, in no particular formation, just walking ad lib, and members of the White House staff, people from the White House grounds here, some of them falling into the procession to join the walk to the church.
John Kennedy Sr. had taught John Kennedy Jr. to salute when he saw an American flag, and his mother pointed out there was a flag on the coffin.
Now the casket has reached the graveside.
body, protection of soul, and grace to follow in the way of the wonderful man whom we bury here today. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
The president belongs to the edges.
On Thanksgiving Day, Mrs. John Kennedy returned to her husband's gravesite for the 5th time. And not long after, the late president's family moved back into Georgetown, not far from where John F. Kennedy and his wife had lived before, after they were married, when he was a promising young senator from Massachusetts.
"1963, a television album with Harry Reasoner reporting will continue in a moment.
This is WCBS-TV, Channel 2 in New York.
Lee Harvey Oswald, the man believed to be the assassin of our president, was a truant who became a teenage Marxist, a man who fled to Russia because he hated capitalism, yet found he couldn't live under communism either. He was a failure, a misfit, a man alone. Oswald was arrested less than 3 hours after the president was shot. He was accused first of killing Dallas policeman J.D. Tippit. Then police said they were convinced he was also Mr. Kennedy's assassin. Then the police produced the mail-order rifle they say he used to kill the president. Oswald denied it.
I really don't know what the situation is about. Nobody has told me anything except that I'm accused of murdering a policeman. I know nothing more than that, and I do request for someone to come forward to give me a legal assistance.
Did you kill the president?
No, I have not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
Then on Sunday, November 24th, the incredible happened. Oswald himself was murdered.
This is the basement floor of the Dallas City Hall, and that's a scuffle on the basement floor. It seems
He has been shot. Oswald has been shot.
The killer, Jack Rubenstein, otherwise known as Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub operator, a man who said he was a great admirer of President Kennedy. This was the scene in slow motion. From the right, a stocky man in a soft hat moved forward. That was Jack Ruby. A pistol was in his hand. That was the fateful moment, one which would take from the nation its chance to find out what was in Lee Oswald's head. Ruby is subdued and arrested, and Lee Harvey Oswald is dead an hour later, accused but untried, not yet guilty by law. The Presidential Commission, selected to investigate the Kennedy assassination, still is conducting its inquiry. Some government sources predict it may be a year before it is completed. Even then, it may leave many questions unanswered. And Jack Ruby still faces a murder trial. His attorneys say he will plead not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. Presidents die, the presidency lives. On the day of John Kennedy's funeral, Lyndon Johnson was not only the grieving friend and ally, he was the working successor in the most powerful job in the world, meeting and making himself and his wife known to the world leaders who had come to the funeral. Hume of Britain himself knew in his job. De Gaulle of France. Mikoyan of Russia, dozens of others. And 2 days later, the new president went before Congress. The nation heard solemn eloquence in a new accent.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, members of the House, members of the Senate, my fellow Americans, all I have, I would have given gladly not to be standing here today. The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time. Today, John Fitzgerald Kennedy lives on in the immortal words and works that he left behind. He lives on in the mind and memories of mankind. He lives on in the hearts of his countrymen. No words are sad enough to express our sense of loss. No words are strong enough to express our determination to continue the forward thrust of America that he began. For 32 years, Capitol Hill has been my home. I have shared many moments of pride with you. Pride in the ability of the Congress of the United States to act, to meet any crisis, to distill from our differences strong programs of national action. An assassin's bullet has thrust upon me the awesome burden of the presidency. I am here today to say I need your help. I cannot bear this burden alone. I need the help of all Americans in all America. Our most immediate tasks are here on this hill. First, no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is time now to write the next chapter and to write it in the books of law. John Kennedy's death commands what his life conveyed, that America must move forward. The time has come for Americans of all races and creeds and political beliefs to understand and to respect one another. So let us put an end to the teaching and the preaching of hate and evil and violence. Let us turn away from the fanatics of the far left and the far right, from the apostles of bitterness and bigotry, from those defiant of law, and those who pour venom into our nation's bloodstream.
Last week, President Johnson came to New York to reassure the United Nations that belief in it is still fundamental U.S. policy. In the new consciousness of danger, security measures had never been tighter.
If there is one commitment, more than any other, that I would like to leave with you today, it is my unswerving commitment to the keeping and to the strengthening of the peace. Peace is a journey of 1,000 miles, and it must be taken one step at a time. We know what we want. The United States of America wants to see the Cold War end. We want to see it end once and for all. The United States wants to prevent the dissemination of nuclear weapons to nations not now possessing them. The United States wants to press on with arms control and reduction. The United States wants to cooperate with all the members of this organization to conquer everywhere the ancient enemies of mankind, hunger and disease and ignorance. The United States wants sanity and security and peace for all, and above all, President Kennedy, I'm sure, would regard as his best memorial the fact that in his 3 years as president, the world became a little safer. and the way ahead became a little brighter. To the protection and the enlargement of this new hope for peace, I pledge my country and its government.
As we said some 115 minutes ago, it's been quite a year. Even with 2 hours, there are pictures in the album we didn't look at. The mine in Japan where 452 died, the smashed railroad trains in Japan that killed 162, the place where a town used to be in Italy before a dam broke and the waters obliterated it. And there were events in 1963 that not all our modern abilities could photograph. There is little knowledge and no pictures of what happened to the nuclear submarine Thresher. In a straight line, miner Lou Bova was only a few hundred feet from his fellow men in that Pennsylvania hill, but sometimes man is helpless, and in effect he was as far from pictures or rescue or even consolation as the men on the Thresher dropping down through the crushing water. Since November 22nd, it has seemed to be a year of tragedy. No count has shown that overall, by numbers, it has been a particularly worse year than a lot of others, and there have been some good things about it. But since John Kennedy died, there has been this feeling of unease. I can't explain it, people say to each other, but I can't shake it. There are people who start a little when their telephones ring. There are men who make an extra check around their sleeping homes at night and count the family coming down in the morning. This is all natural enough. The violent death of a great and important man touches us all, not only with our loss, but with the reminder of our own mortality. But something more than this new understanding of life's fragility can come out of our experience. It is here that perhaps the idea of the end of a year is helpful in a way entirely unassociated with marking the movements of the planet. People will say, late in the evening on December 31st this year, a lot more than usual, I'm glad this one's over. And it will be over. At 1 minute past midnight, President Kennedy's assassination and the Pope's death and whatever tragedy you know best, all will be things that happened last year. Since man can remember, widows and orphans have at first refused to believe and then have slowly learned that time does heal. It heals not by wiping away memories or diminishing love or grief, but by a curious process of understanding that comes as news becomes history. News from Dallas or Rome or next door. News may sadden and disturb. History enriches and instructs, if we permit it to. And history rewrites news by the use we make of it for good or ill. 1963 is almost history now. It is the year that John Kennedy was killed. There is a place in the Jewish service of mourning where the rabbi says, let us now think of the virtues of the dead man, the things that we admired about him, and let us promise to do our best to emulate those virtues in memory of him, for this is the only certain immortality. Another way of saying that, with which all religions would agree, is that it is certainly an immortality that we can give. This is Harry Reasoner. Good afternoon.
"1963, a television album" with Harry Reasoner. These have been some of the highlights and sounds by which we remember the year. Of the many CBS News cameramen who have contributed to this album were Albert Gretz, Arthur Kingen, Larry Races, Herb Schwartz, Richard Perez, Wendell Hoffman, Robert Hess, Ralph Santos, Bruce Hortel, John Besser, Thomas Craven, Ronald Koza, Fred Dietrich, Cyril Bliss, Mario Biasetti, John Tiffin, Jürgen Neumann, Tomiharu Ishii, Jerry Schwarzkopf, George Markman, Alex Brower, Joe Masraf, Jean Wright-Berger, Merle Severn, Jürgen Tom, Ha Tuk Khan, James Pickrell. Those are news film cameramen. Among the many others who contributed to this pictorial record are the technicians who manned the live television cameras in Rome, Washington, Hazleton, Berlin, and the videotape editors who recorded the remote broadcasts and assembled them for this album. This program, pre-recorded, has been produced by CBS News, which has sole responsibility for the content and editing.